Most prisons just want to keep people in. These 15 were built to make absolutely sure of it, with razor wire, laser beams, and guard-to-prisoner ratios that would make a bank vault jealous. Some hold the world's most dangerous killers. Others held the world's most inconvenient truths. So here are 15 most guarded prisons on Earth you're not supposed to know. Number 15, Kamiti Maximum Security Prison, Kenya. Kamiti sits just outside Nairobi, and since opening in the 1950s during the British colonial era, it has functioned as Kenya's primary maximum security facility, holding the country's most violent offenders and, for decades, its death row population. Originally built to detain Mau Mau independence fighters resisting British rule, the prison's layout and reputation for harsh discipline have stuck around long after Kenya became independent in 1963. Security here relies less on modern technology and more on sheer manpower, with armed guards stationed throughout multiple perimeter fences and watchtowers surrounding a facility that regularly holds several thousand inmates at a time. Kenya has maintained the death penalty on its books, though executions have been suspended in practice for years, meaning Kamiti has effectively become a permanent holding facility for prisoners whose sentences technically call for a punishment the country has quietly stopped carrying out. Reports from human rights organizations over the years have repeatedly flagged severe overcrowding, with the prison at times holding roughly double its intended capacity, a problem shared by much of Kenya's prison system, but felt most acutely at the facility meant to house the country's most dangerous men. The prison's colonial-era origins still shape how it functions today. Kamiti was built using forced prison labor during a period when the British administration was actively suppressing the Mau Mau uprising, and some of the original detention blocks used to hold suspected rebels remain part of the active facility decades later. In recent years, Kenyan officials have periodically floated modernization plans, including improved rehabilitation programs and vocational training for inmates, though independent monitors say the pace of reform has lagged well behind the prison's continued role as the default destination for the country's most violent convicted offenders. Number 14, Butyrka Prison, Moscow, Russia. Butyrka has been holding prisoners in the heart of Moscow since the late 1700s, making it one of the oldest continuously operating detention facilities in Russia. And its list of former inmates reads like a survey of Russian history itself, from anarchist Nestor Makhno and writer Isaac Babel to countless political prisoners swept up during Stalin's purges in the 1930s. Unlike a standard prison, Butyrka primarily functions as a pretrial detention center, holding suspects for months or even years while their cases work through Russia's court system, often under conditions international monitors have described as severely overcrowded and outdated. Its imposing brick walls and narrow, centuries-old cell blocks give it a genuinely different security profile than a modern supermax, relying on sheer institutional weight and Moscow's tightly controlled judicial system rather than high-tech perimeter defenses. The facility's darkest chapter came during the Soviet era, when it served as a key transit point for prisoners headed to the Gulag labor camp system, processing untold thousands of people before shipping them off to Siberia, a grim historical footnote that still shadows the building's reputation, even as it continues operating as an active detention center today. Even the building's basic architecture reflects that grim history. Butyrka's cell blocks were designed around narrow interior corridors and small, high windows meant to make orientation and escape nearly impossible, features that have barely changed since the facility was expanded under Catherine the Great in the late 18th century. More recent international attention arrived in 2009, when Russian tax lawyer Sergei Magnitsky died in the prison's custody after being denied adequate medical care, a case that prompted the United States and other Western governments to pass sanctions legislation bearing his name, turning one detainee's death inside Butyrka's walls into a lasting fixture of international diplomacy. Number 13, Fleury-Mérogis Prison, France. Fleury-Mérogis, just south of Paris, holds the title of the largest prison in Europe, a sprawling complex built in the early 1970s and designed around 5 separate star-shaped housing units radiating out from central control points, an architectural layout meant to let guards monitor enormous numbers of inmates with minimal staff. On paper, the prison was built to hold around 2,900 people. In practice, it has regularly operated well above that capacity. The facility houses everything from pretrial detainees to convicted terrorists, and its high-security wings have held individuals connected to some of France's most significant terrorism cases in recent decades, requiring specialized isolation units and constant surveillance separate from the general population. French authorities have repeatedly cited Fleury-Mérogis in national debates over prison overcrowding, with watchdog groups documenting occupancy rates exceeding 150% in certain wings at various points. Despite its scale, the prison has faced persistent criticism over the years for smuggled contraband, including phones and weapons, getting into even its most secure sections. A reminder that in a facility this large, sheer size can sometimes work against airtight security rather than for it. The star-shaped design that made Fleury-Mérogis architecturally notable when it opened has also made it a genuine logistical challenge for staff, since guards moving between housing units often have to travel significant distances through connecting corridors just to respond to incidents. A layout critics have argued slows emergency response times compared to more compact modern facilities. French officials broke ground on a major renovation project in the 2000s, specifically aimed at improving both security infrastructure and inmate living conditions. Though prison reform advocates have continued to describe the site's overall environment as closer to a small, overcrowded city than a single controlled institution, complete with its own internal economy, gang dynamics, and persistent staffing shortages that regularly make national headlines in France. Number 12. Diyarbakir Prison, Turkey. Diyarbakir Prison, in southeastern Turkey, became one of the country's most notorious detention facilities following the 1980 military coup, when it was used to hold thousands of political prisoners, many accused of Kurdish separatist activity or leftist political organizing. Human rights organizations have documented widespread allegations of torture and abuse at the facility throughout the 1980s, testimony that helped shape decades of Kurdish political memory in the region. The prison's high-security wings were built to isolate prisoners considered the most serious threats to state security, with layered checkpoints and restricted visitation designed to cut inmates off almost entirely from outside contact. Turkish authorities have periodically announced reform efforts at the facility in the decades since, though international monitoring groups have continued raising concerns about conditions well into the 21st century. Diyarbakir's reputation has become so deeply embedded in Kurdish political history that former inmates, journalists, and human rights groups have pushed for years to have parts of the original complex preserved as a memorial site, a rare case of a maximum security prison being treated as much like a historical monument as an active piece of infrastructure. Testimonies collected from former detainees over the decades describe a regimented daily existence built specifically to strip away individual identity. From forced marching drills to compulsory recitation of nationalist slogans, practices survivors and researchers have since documented extensively in books and oral history projects examining Turkey's post-coup period. The facility's reputation eventually became so internationally damaging that Turkish authorities relocated the majority of its prison population to a newer complex in the early 2000s. Though the original Diyarbakir site itself remained under military and later civilian control for years afterward, its name still carrying enough weight in the region that mentioning it in conversation is, for many older Kurds, still enough to change the tone of a room. Number 11. Sednaya Prison, Syria. For decades, Sednaya Prison north of Damascus operated as one of the Syrian government's most secretive detention facilities, so opaque that Amnesty International titled a 2017 investigation into the site "Human Slaughterhouse," documenting mass hangings, systematic torture, and estimates that as many as 13,000 people may have been secretly executed there between 2011 and 2015 alone. The prison's true scale only became publicly clear in December 2024 when rebel forces overthrew the government of Bashar al-Assad and opened Sednaya's gates, revealing hidden underground cells, trapdoors, and networks of tunnels that families of the missing had spent years searching desperately for information about. Rescue workers and journalists who entered the facility described finding prisoners who had been held in complete isolation for years, some barely aware the outside world had changed at all. The security apparatus that kept Sednaya functioning for so long relied less on visible fortification and more on total secrecy, with the Syrian government denying international monitors meaningful access for the better part of 2 decades. What emerged after its liberation turned out to be one of the starkest examples in recent history of just how much a government can hide inside a single building when nobody's allowed to look. Survivors who walked free in December 2024 described a facility organized almost like an assembly line of cruelty, with a section nicknamed the White Building, reportedly reserved for prisoners marked for execution, and a separate area known among detainees as the Red Building, holding those still awaiting sentencing or interrogation. Rescue teams using cutting tools and even sniffer dogs spent days searching for rumored underground levels that some former guards had described in earlier testimony, though the search ultimately failed to locate any secret basement beyond what had already been uncovered, leaving families of the disappeared with painfully few new answers, even after the prison itself had finally been thrown open to the world. Number 10. Tadmor Prison, Syria. Tadmor Prison sat in the Syrian desert near the ancient ruins of Palmyra, originally built as a military barracks under French colonial rule before becoming one of the most feared detention facilities in the entire Middle East. Amnesty International once described it bluntly as synonymous with despair, torture, and degrading treatment, and its reputation was cemented for good on June 27, 1980, when Syrian government forces stormed the prison in retaliation for a failed assassination attempt on President Hafez al-Assad, killing somewhere between 500 and 1,100 unarmed prisoners in a single morning. The facility officially closed in 2001, only to reopen a decade later once Syria's civil war began generating a fresh wave of political detainees. Security at Tadmor relied on total isolation, both physically, given its remote desert location, and administratively, with prisoners cut off almost entirely from legal counsel, family contact, or outside oversight for years at a time. In May 2015, ISIS militants captured Palmyra and, within days, blew up the prison complex entirely, filming the demolition and posting it online the same way they documented destroying the area's ancient ruins. It was a strange, almost symbolic end for a building whose name in Arabic, fittingly, translates roughly to destruction. Number 9. Robben Island, South Africa. Robben Island sits about 7 miles off the coast of Cape Town, and from 1961 to 1991, it functioned as South Africa's primary maximum security prison for political prisoners resisting the apartheid government. Its most famous inmate, Nelson Mandela, spent 18 of his 27 years in prison there, working in a blinding limestone quarry that permanently damaged his eyesight, alongside fellow anti-apartheid leaders including Govan Mbeki and Walter Sisulu. Security on the island relied heavily on its natural isolation, cold, treacherous currents that made escape by sea essentially suicidal, combined with strict racial segregation policies that governed everything from prisoners' uniforms to their meal rations, deliberately designed to divide inmates along racial lines, even within a prison built to punish people for opposing exactly that kind of division. The prison closed for good in 1996, 2 years after apartheid officially ended, and in 1997, it reopened as a museum, with several former political prisoners now working as tour guides, walking visitors past the same cells where they once served their own sentences. It remains one of the only maximum security prisons in the world where the person giving you the tour might have actually done time there. Mandela's own cell, a Spartan 7 by 9-foot room where a single light bulb burned above his head around the clock for 18 years, has become the island's most visited site, drawing hundreds of thousands of tourists annually who take the same ferry ride across Table Bay that once carried prisoners toward indefinite confinement. Before it ever became a political prison, Robben Island had already spent centuries serving other forms of forced isolation, first as a place of banishment for Dutch colonial-era outcasts, later as a leper colony where patients were sent specifically because the surrounding waters made escape and disease transmission back to the mainland nearly impossible. A grim through line of enforced separation stretching back more than 300 years before Mandela ever set foot there. Number 8. North Korea's political prison camps. North Korea operates a network of political prison camps, known internally as Kwanliso, that the government has never officially acknowledged exist, despite satellite imagery repeatedly confirming their scale and continued expansion over the decades. Camp 16, near Hwaseong, is believed to be the largest in the system, covering hundreds of square kilometers, an area analysts have compared to roughly 3 times the size of Washington, D.C. Unlike conventional prisons built around walls and guard towers, these camps function more like entire enclosed territories, complete with mining operations, logging, and agricultural work that prisoners are forced to perform, often for the remainder of their lives, alongside family members detained under North Korea's policy of guilt by association, which can imprison up to 3 generations of a single family for one person's alleged offense. Because North Korea denies international human rights investigators any meaningful access, most of what's known about conditions inside comes from satellite analysis and testimony from the small number of former guards and prisoners who've managed to escape the country entirely. One former camp official who spoke anonymously to human rights researchers described witnessing detainees forced to dig their own graves, testimony that remains, by necessity, one of the only windows the outside world has into a system built specifically to stay invisible. Analysts tracking satellite imagery over the years have documented new housing blocks and expanding industrial facilities being constructed inside several of these camps, even as international pressure to close the system has grown, evidence that the North Korean government has, if anything, continued investing in the infrastructure rather than winding it down. Human rights researchers estimate the total number of people held across the entire Kwanliso network at somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000. Though exact figures are impossible to verify given the complete absence of independent access, and the United Nations' own Commission of Inquiry concluded in 2014 that conditions inside amounted to crimes against humanity, a finding the North Korean government has never acknowledged, let alone responded to in any meaningful way. Number 7. Pelican Bay State Prison, California. Pelican Bay sits in the far northern corner of California, just 13 miles from the Oregon border, a location chosen deliberately to separate Southern California gang members from their networks of influence back home. Opened in 1989, the prison's security housing unit, known simply as the SHU, was designed to hold roughly 1,000 of the state's most dangerous inmates in near-total isolation, confined to windowless 8 by 10-foot cells for over 22 hours a day. At its peak in the 1990s, the SHU held close to 2,000 prisoners, some in solitary confinement for over a decade, with exercise limited to a bare concrete yard nicknamed a dog run by inmates. In 2011, and again in 2013, prisoners organized coordinated hunger strikes that spread to tens of thousands of inmates across California's entire prison system, protesting conditions advocates had long argued amounted to psychological torture. Those strikes eventually forced real change. A 2015 legal settlement dramatically curtailed indefinite solitary confinement based purely on suspected gang affiliation, reducing long-term SHU placements by roughly 99% within a year. A rare case of prisoners inside one of the country's most secure facilities successfully forcing the system that isolated them to change. Even the criteria that originally sent people to the SHU drew sustained criticism from civil rights advocates. since prisoners could be assigned there indefinitely not for a specific violent act, but simply based on a gang validation process built largely on circumstantial evidence like tattoos, artwork, or letters intercepted by guards. Following the settlement, state officials reviewed hundreds of existing cases and found that only a small fraction of previously validated inmates actually required continued long-term isolation, a statistic reform advocates have repeatedly pointed to as evidence that the system had, for years, been isolating far more people than it ever needed to. Number 6. Attica Correctional Facility, New York. Attica opened in 1931, built with 30-foot walls and guard towers specifically designed to be escape-proof. And for decades it functioned as one of New York's primary maximum security prisons without drawing much national attention. That changed permanently on September 9, 1971, when roughly 1,300 inmates, protesting overcrowding and inhumane conditions, seized control of the facility and took dozens of staff members hostage. For 4 days, prisoners negotiated with state officials, presenting a list of demands focused on basic human rights and improved treatment. When talks broke down, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller ordered state police to retake the prison by force on September 13th, and the resulting assault, involving tear gas and hundreds of rounds of live ammunition, killed 39 people, including 10 of the hostages, in what remains the deadliest prison confrontation in American history. The aftermath reshaped American corrections policy for decades, forcing a national reckoning over prison conditions and inmate treatment. Attica remains an active maximum security facility today, its original 1930s walls still standing, a physical reminder of both its original design purpose and the single deadliest failure of that design ever recorded. For decades after the assault, survivors and hostages' families fought a lengthy legal battle over how the retaking had actually unfolded. Since initial official accounts claimed inmates had killed the hostages, a version of events later contradicted by autopsy reports showing all 10 hostages died from gunfire fired by state police rather than by prisoners. That revelation, along with a class action lawsuit brought by inmates who survived the retaking, eventually resulted in a $12 million settlement in 2000, nearly 3 decades after the uprising, a case that remains one of the longest-running legal battles to ever emerge from an American prison riot. Number 5. HMP Belmarsh, United Kingdom. HMP Belmarsh opened in 1991 in southeast London, becoming the first new men's prison built in the capital in over a century, and it quickly became the designated holding facility for the country's most serious offenders, Category A prisoners facing charges including terrorism, murder, and organized crime. Its reputation as Britain's Guantanamo first took hold in the early 2000s when the government used emergency post-9/11 legislation to detain foreign terrorism suspects there indefinitely without charge or trial. The House of Lords ultimately ruled that practice unlawful in 2004, but the nickname stuck, and it resurfaced with renewed intensity after WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange was held there from April 2019 until his release in 2024, drawing international attention and protest over what critics called years of imprisonment without formal conviction. Security at Belmarsh operates on a tiered system, with the most sensitive prisoners held in a separate high-security unit within the prison itself, subject to additional restrictions on visitation, mail, and movement. Notable past and present inmates have included armed robber Charles Bronson, radical preacher Abu Hamza, and Lee Rigby's convicted killer, making Belmarsh, by most measures, the single most consequential prison in modern British criminal justice. Number 4. Bang Kwang Central Prison, Thailand. Bang Kwang sits along the Chao Phraya River just outside Bangkok, and Thai locals have nicknamed it the Big Tiger for its reputation of, essentially, eating men alive. Built in 1931, it houses roughly 6,000 inmates, including Thailand's primary death row, and it earned its darkly ironic international nickname, the Bangkok Hilton, from decades of foreign prisoners describing conditions about as far from a luxury hotel as physically possible. For most of its history, every new inmate, regardless of sentence, was forced to wear heavy iron leg shackles for a minimum of 3 months, a practice widely understood among former prisoners as less about preventing escape and more about breaking incoming inmates' spirits before they ever settled in. That practice was largely abolished in 2013, though some high-risk prisoners have reportedly still been shackled since. Life inside runs on what's known as the chit system, an internal economy where the prison provides only a single free bowl of rice and watery vegetables a day, and anything beyond that, better food, medicine, basic comforts, has to be purchased, leaving foreign inmates with no local support network dependent almost entirely on embassy assistance or outside charity drives just to get enough to eat. Number 3. Black Dolphin Prison, Russia. Black Dolphin, officially Correctional Colony Number 6, sits in the remote steppe town of Sol-Iletsk in Russia's Orenburg Oblast, near the Kazakhstan border, and it holds roughly 700 to 900 of Russia's most dangerous life-sentenced inmates, including serial killers, terrorists, and men convicted of cannibalism. The facility dates back to at least 1745, originally serving as a fortress and hard-labor jail before being converted specifically for life-sentence prisoners after Russia abolished the death penalty in 1996. Security measures here go well beyond standard maximum security protocol. Inmates are never moved without handcuffs and are always escorted by at least 2 guards accompanied by trained dogs. Prisoners are required to stand for up to 16 hours a day, with sitting or lying down permitted only after lights out, and even confession with a prison chaplain takes place through the bars of a small cage rather than face-to-face. The prison takes its nickname from a sculpture of a black dolphin carved by inmates themselves that stands near the main entrance, a strangely gentle image guarding a facility widely regarded as one of the harshest and most tightly controlled prisons anywhere on Earth. Number 2. Guantanamo Bay Detention Camp, Cuba. The United States has controlled Guantanamo Bay under a lease with Cuba dating back to 1903, and while the naval base itself predates any detention operations by nearly a century, its modern reputation was cemented in January 2002 when the first terrorism suspects captured in Afghanistan were transferred there following the September 11th attacks. Over the following 2 decades, the facility held approximately 780 detainees total, many without formal charges or trial, under legal arrangements specifically designed to sidestep standard prisoner of war protections. Security at Guantanamo operates on a scale most domestic prisons never approach, with detainees held in isolated purpose-built camps, extensive military perimeter defenses, and restrictions so tight that even visiting journalists and legal representatives operate under close, constant military supervision. As of recent counts, roughly 3 dozen detainees remain held there, some more than 2 decades after their initial detention began. The facility's combination of geographic isolation, being on an island governed under a permanent military lease outside standard American legal jurisdiction, and its historically opaque access policies have made it one of the most scrutinized and criticized detention facilities in the world, a genuinely unique case of a prison whose security is built as much on legal architecture as physical walls. Number 1. ADX Florence, Colorado. No list like this one could end anywhere else. ADX Florence, officially the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, sits in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains and holds the distinction of being the only federal supermax prison in the country, nicknamed the Alcatraz of the Rockies for its remote location and near-mythical security reputation. Opened in 1994 after 2 correctional officers were murdered at a previous federal facility, ADX was built specifically to hold America's most dangerous, escape-prone, and disruptive inmates in near-total isolation. The security measures here are genuinely staggering. 12-foot razor-wire fencing surrounds the compound, backed by 1,400 remote-controlled steel doors, motion detectors, pressure pads, laser beams, attack dogs, and armed sharpshooters stationed in surrounding watchtowers. Inmates spend roughly 23 hours a day alone in reinforced concrete cells, And in over 3 decades of operation, not a single person has ever successfully escaped. The current inmate roster reads like a list of America's most notorious criminals, including Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, 9/11 plotter Zacarias Moussaoui, and Sinaloa cartel leader Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, a man who'd previously tunneled his way out of 2 separate Mexican prisons before landing somewhere even he apparently couldn't find a way out of. Former ADX warden Robert Hood once described conditions inside bluntly, calling it a clean version of hell, a description that stuck around precisely because it captures the facility's entire design philosophy. Nothing about ADX is meant to be cruel in an obvious, visible way, and everything about it is meant to be inescapable. Nearly 30 years after it first opened, that reputation hasn't softened, and neither has the record. As of the most recent counts, ADX Florence houses roughly 400 men, and in over 3 decades of operation, exactly 0 of them have ever made it out the way they didn't want to. 15 prisons, guarded by razor wire, satellite surveillance, armed patrols, and in some cases decades of total government secrecy, and every single one of them proves the same point. Some walls are built to keep people in, and some are built to keep the entire world from finding out what's happening behind them. From a supermax in the Rockies to a facility Syria hid for over a decade, the line between security and secrecy turns out to be thinner than most governments would ever admit out loud. If you enjoyed this one, hit like, subscribe for more of these, and let me know in the comments which of these you'd never want to end up inside. See you in the next video.